All right, let's look at distances for the Mixolydian. So distances, if we go 0 modal half steps up, first scale degree, 0 notes up, we're going to call that flame. Same as we've seen before. Call it a perfect first, call it a 0 note away from the Mixolydian, 0 modal half step, still going to be flame. If we go 2 modal half steps up, third scale degree, that's going to be 4 notes up, which we call mint. So you can call it a 4 note away major third, which is the same for all the major modes. 4 note away Mixolydian, 2 modal half steps, still mint. So we have then 4 notes away, 4 modal half steps away, 5th scale degree. It's going to be that very solid 7 notes up, which is just azure. 7 note away perfect first, azure. 7 note away from the Mixolydian, 4 modal half steps, azure. If we go 6 notes up, which is the 7th scale degree, we have a difference, a 10. That's where it's different. That's the minor distance, not the major distance. So this time it's going to be 10 is fuchsia. Fuchsia. So we have then a 10 note away minor 7, fuchsia. 10 note away from the Mixolydian node, 6 modal half steps, fuchsia. If we go 8 modal half steps up, 9th scale degree, it's going to be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12. If we take the octave, that's going to be a 2 note away major second, or major 9. It's going to be a chartreuse. Same thing we had before. 2 note away Mixolydian, 8 modal half steps, chartreuse. 10 notes away, 10 modal half steps up, 11th scale degree. It's going to be a 5 distance up, which is aqua. So we can call that a 5 note away perfect fourth, same as we had before, aqua. 5 note away from the Mixolydian, 10 modal half steps, aqua. You could also call this a perfect 11. So we have then a 12 modal half steps up, 13th scale degree. It's going to be 9 notes up, same as we had before. Orchid is the color. So it's going to be a 9 note away major 6 or major 16. If we take the octave, it's orchid. It's going to be a 9 note away from the Mixolydian, 12 modal half steps, orchid. This is going to be the notes. If we look at it from the perspective of the G, this color system will be different from our chord color system, which is based not on note point, but relative position. We could see the major would be consumed up top with the major, and then they had to break out this whole category because it's the 7 that gets messed up, which means that's as soon as we get 4 notes in the chord, it gets messed up, and that's going to mess up all of the rest of them. So we have a whole column for it. Aeolian to the minor modes. So the minor modes are red, so we can say it's going to be an A minor in our case, but the A doesn't tell me, or the A minor doesn't tell me if it's an Aeolian, Dorian, or Phrygian. So I'd rather call it something like a 3-note Aeolian or a the third shade of gray chord. I mean, the third shade of red chord, meaning it's a 3-note red chord, right? Because it's based on the Aeolian. We could call it an Aeolian A2, but the A is redundant. I'd like to drop the A and just call it an Aeolian 2 modal whole step chord. If the Aeolian is the tonic, we can capitalize the A, not to represent it as the note, but the Aeolian node 2, will not get mixed up with the note if we remove all the notes when we write all this down, right? We don't have the notes in there. We have removed them so we can move this up through all collections of notes. Now, again, you'd like to say we're in the collection of notes around C major, and the tonic then is the minor. You could say we're in the collection of notes of A minor, but that's forcing us to have a different formula to figure out the collection of notes. So either way would work. I just think it's nicer to do it the other way as a convention, as is done by the Nashville number system. So that's going to include 613 or the Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian. You could call it an AP modal range chord, or a red to a spring green. Spring green. That's not spring green. A red to a sky blue modal range. What if we have an A minor 7? So the 7s are going to be the same for all of the minors. So that's going to be within all of them, but I'd rather call it, so I don't know which note I'm on, I'd rather call it a 4-note Aeolian chord, or a 4th shade of red chord. 4th shade of red chord. You could call it an Aeolian A 3 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you already know the collection of notes, so you could call it an Aeolian 3 modal whole step. 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, which is the 7th scale degree, landing you on the 5 Nashville number system, or the Mixolydian, which means you could call it an Aeolian Mixolydian modal range chord, or a red magenta modal range chord. Next one, we have an A minor 9. So I'd rather get rid of the A and name it by point, which would be a 5-note Aeolian chord, or the 5th shade of red chord, which you could call an Aeolian A4 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you know the collection of notes. An A4 modal whole step chord, 4 times 2 is 8. Modal half steps, which would be the 9th scale degree, which would be the Nashville number 7, or Locrian. So you could call it an Aeolian Locrian chord, or an Aeolian or a red-yellow modal range chord. So then we have an A minor 11. I'd rather call it a 6-note Aeolian chord, or the 6th shade of red chord, which is an Aeolian, you could call it an Aeolian A5 modal whole step chord, but the A is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Rather call it an Aeolian 5 modal whole step chord. 5 times 2 is 10, which would be the 11th scale degree, which is the 2 Nashville number system, the Dorian. So you could call it an AD modal range chord, or a red to the spring green modal range chord. And then finally we have the A minor flat 13, which needs an extension, which is weird, but I'd rather be easier to call it a 7-note Aeolian, or the 7th shade of red chord, which would be an Aeolian A6 chord, but the A is redundant. You could just call it an A6 modal whole step chord. 6 times 2 is 12, and 13 therefore is the scale degree, which gives us 4 as the natural number system, or Lydian. So it'd be an Aeolian Lydian chord, or an A or a red-blue chord. Distances for the Aeolian. You get a 0 note away, a 0 modal half step away, 1st scale degree, which would be 0 notes, flame, perfect first flame, 0 note away from the Aeolian, 0 modal half step, flame. You have then 2 modal half steps up, 3rd scale degree would be 3 notes up, which is going to be lime color. This is different than what we have before. Similar color, but different, right? Because it's a half step away, so that's why they're so similar in color, but they're going to be different. So then we have so the 3 is going to 3 note away minor 3rd, and 3 note away from the Aeolian node, 2nd modal half step, both of them lime color as opposed to mint color. Then we have a 4 modal half steps up, 5th scale degree, which is that solid distance again, as we saw all the time before, 7 notes away, solid azure, 7 note away, perfect 5th, azure, 7 note away from the Aeolian node, 4th modal half step, azure. So 6 modal half steps up, 7th scale degree will be 10 notes away, which is the same we had on the Mixolydian, but different from the Ionian and the Lydian, because that's the minor distance, which is fuchsia. So it's going to be a 10 note away minor 7, fuchsia, 10 note away from the Aeolian node, 6 modal half step, fuchsia. So if we go to the 8th modal half step, which is the 9th scale degree, it would be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12. That'd be a 2 note away major 2nd, or major 9, which is going to be chartreuse. 2 note away from the Aeolian node, 8 modal half steps, chartreuse. If we go then 10 modal half steps up, 11 scale degree, 5 notes up, it's going to be aqua. 5 note away, perfect 4th, or perfect 11, aqua. 5 note away from the Aeolian node, 10 modal half steps, aqua. 12 modal half steps up, 13th scale degree is going to be 8 notes away, which is grape. 8 is grape. So we're going to have an 8 note away minor 6, grape, or 8 note away minor 6, 13, grape. 8 note away from the Aeolian node, 12 modal half steps, grape. These are the relative colors based on A as the note. And then this is going to be the buckets. So they all fit into this bucket as we would expect, except this one doesn't, which we would not expect. That's weird. Let's keep it rolling because we're running short on time. So Dorian, you would expect it to be much the same. D minor, D minor. D stands for the note here. I'd rather make it based on the modal point. I'd rather call it a 3-note Dorian chord, or you can call it the 3rd shade of spring green, because that's the color. 3rd shade of spring green chord. You could call it a Dorian D2 chord, but the D is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Rather call it a Dorian 2 modal whole step chord. Remember, and if you're playing in D Dorian, you could emphasize that by capitalizing the D not standing for the note, but the Dorian node, because we removed the notes from our convention so we can easily transpose. But So I'd still rather name the collection of notes based on the relative major, C major collection of notes, but we're on the Dorian node. Or you could just say we're in D Dorian, and then you have to figure it out from the Dorian. But I don't think that should be the normal convention most of the time, because it's nicer not to say it by the one convention. You'd be a 2, 4, 6 from the modal points. So that would be a Dorian Aeolian or a spring green Aeolian, spring green red modal range chord. Then you can have a D minor 7. I'd rather call it a 4-note away, 4-note Dorian chord, or the 4th shade of spring green chord. Could call it a Dorian D3 chord, but the D is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Could call it then just a Dorian 3 modal whole step chord, or 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. 1 would be the Nashville number point, which is the Aeolian Dorian Ionian. So that would be a spring green to yellow green modal range chord. Then we have a D minor 9 that I'd rather call a 5-note Dorian, or the 5th shade of spring green chord. Could call it a D4 chord, but the second D is redundant if you know the collection of notes. Rather call it a D4 modal whole step chord. 4 times 2 is 8 modal half steps, plus 1 is 9 scale degree, which would give us 3 from a Nashville number system, which is the P for Phrygian spring green to sky blue modal range chord. Then we have the D minor 11, which I'd rather call a 6-note Dorian chord, or the 6th shade of spring green chord, which could call it a D5 chord, but the D is redundant. I'd rather call it a D5 modal whole step chord. 5 times 2 is 10 modal half steps, plus 1 is the 11th scale degree, which would give us the 5 as the Nashville number system, which is Mixolydian, which would be then a spring green to magenta modal range chord. D minor 13. I'd rather call it a 7-note Dorian chord, 7th shade of spring green chord, which you call a Dorian D6 modal whole step chord, but the D is redundant. Just a Dorian 6 modal whole step chord. 6 times 2 is 12 modal half steps, plus 1 13 scale degree, gives us the point Nashville number system 7, which is Locrian or yellow.